Okay, so we're at the stage where we need to start flattening some rings. And there's a couple methods of doing that. And those methods really vary on who you know and what your budget is. Certainly if you had a drum sander, that is probably the best way to go. And you know, if you know a friendly cabinet shop guy that'll let you use his, that's a real luxury to use. Certainly, if you had one yourself, again, a great luxury. I actually have a homemade one that works off of my lathe, and maybe in an upcoming video we'll go over that. But I want to show you how I did it the old way, so that way if you don't have a drum sander, you can still do a segmented bowl. So what we start with is, again, some MDF. Very cheap, very rigid, and makes a good substrate for this. So what we have to do is draw some crosshairs on it. And so what I did was just put it on the lathe, trued up the face, and it doesn't have to be absolutely perfectly flat, just pretty much close to being flat. And while it was on the lathe, I took my pencil and made me a little dot right here, of course, and that's going to be the exact center, and this is why you want to do it on the lathe. Also, I came out a couple inches and did a circle, and that is not too important how far the circle is, but I tend to go, you know, close to the edge. And the way this works is we take a straight edge and get this. We take our straight edge and going from our center line, and it doesn't matter where we make our first line as long as it's through the center. We simply make a line. Okay, now the trick here is to come off exactly 90 degrees and draw a second line. And the way you would do that is to use a compass. So how does this work? Well, what we do is we set our compass for, you know, an inch or two bigger than our center point would be. And actually the bigger the better. It'll give you a more accurate measurement. But what you do is you take your point and you put it in the intersection between your first line and your circle. And you come up here, and you make an arc, come down here, make an arc. Come around, simply repeat the process. Now, all you got to do is connect those points like so. And now you have an exact 90 degrees crosshairs. And what we'll do is we'll use that, and being that our piece is 12 sides, then that means there is a joint at every 90 degrees. So we will center that on here. And the way I actually attach these, and you could use double stick tape if you wanted, but I actually prefer hot glue. It definitely holds better than the double stick tape. It's a little, you know, more difficult to clean up, but at this stage, since we're going to you know, basically turn the entire bowl anyway, all that will get cleaned up. So what I'm going to do is hot glue this piece on, and then I'll meet you guys over at the lathe and I'll show you how to flatten them. Alright, so now that we're back set up on the lathe, we're ready to flatten these rings. As you can see, I only used about 4 dabs of hot glue on here. That's plenty for a ring this size. Maybe a few more once you get up to about a 10-inch and even bigger. But that's plenty enough to hold this piece here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come across and try and face this as flat as we possibly can. And after that, then we'll move on to the next step. But let me show you how this is done. Okay, so now that we got the face of this as flat as we possibly can using the tools, the next step is to actually sand it flat. And what I want to use is just a sanding block like this right here. So it's a very long sanding block. It's about 18 inches. And that way it'll, of course, handle any size ring that the lathe itself can handle. So, you know, you can buy the sandpaper in roll form, and it's just spray adhesive on. And the operation is basically turn on the lathe, hold it to it as it's spinning, and that way you get a flat face all the way across. And I've actually already done this one, and it's nice and smooth, as you can see. And I'm sure everybody's wondering about this hole, and if you recall, this is the bottom ring, so we have to fill this hole, but we're not going to do it yet, and we'll do it in another step or two, and I'll explain why I'm not doing it now, and also what we're going to use to fill it. Okay, so we're at the point where we're ready to glue our first 2 sets of rings together. And this will be the next ring up from the bottom, which of course you already seen me face. And all I did was follow the same procedure, just face it with the tools and then go back with the sanding block and make sure it's absolutely flat. So what we have to do is now center the bottom ring on here, but of course we're going to turn it that quarter of a turn so we get like a brick lay pattern. It makes it much stronger and more attractive as well. So while I was facing this ring, I could have basically drawn a circle on here just like I did on the MDF and followed that exact same procedure to draw some crosshairs. The problem with drawing a circle on here is if you're not absolutely centered, your circle will be off, and then everything that you build off of that, of course, will be off as well. Now, even I have crosshairs on the MDF and I centered it as best I could, but for a little added insurance, what I like to do is simply take a scrap block of wood and butt it up to the face of our ring, and then I take me a little ruler or any kind of straight edge, and I simply mark a line. And all you have to do is go make sure you cross each joint. So I'm going to put a line here, and at this joint put a line here. We go straight across, repeat the process, go 90 degrees, repeat the process, and then 90 degrees and repeat the process. Then basically just like we did with the MDF, take our calipers, and now what we're going to do is in the intersection of the pencil line and the segment joint, draw our arc, flip it around to the second pencil line, draw the arc. Okay, so now we have basically a center point within the segment. Come across, do the same procedure, and then of course at 90 degrees. So when we connect those, we now have another set of crosshairs that is exactly centered, but within the ring, or excuse me, within the segment itself. So now all we have to do is line up these joints with those crosshairs, and we're ready to glue. But let me give you a little trick on that. You can, of course, just go ahead and put this down and start putting clamps on. The problem is when you start tightening clamps and you have a glue surface, it wants to slide around on you. So what I like to do is make sure I have it exactly centered on there, and then while it's sitting, let me get it back in here, while it's in there nice and tight, I go and put these little blocks on here, and I just CA those down with some stick fast. If you wanted to use a hot glue, you could do that. But while I got it perfectly centered, I go ahead and I put those down, and that will help ensure that it doesn't slide around. Now you can't be too aggressive because, of course, that bond could still break, the CA bond, and it could slide off. But as long as you tighten it fairly evenly, it should stay centered. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this back off and put some glue on the surface. And what I'll wind up doing is actually taking a scrap piece of MDF and put on top of the whole thing and run my clamps and basically make a big sandwich, simply because the throats of the clamps are not going to be deep enough to get all the way in here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do that, and I'll meet you guys back in just a little bit. So here we are in the clamps, and like I said, I used just a piece of MDF on the top. And if you notice, I've got some material here, and this is actually that drawer liner material, or you could use like a router mat material. And what that's doing is it's acting as a cushion in between the MDF and our lignum vitae. If you recall, we only surfaced one side of the lignum vitae, and that's because after this dries and we mount it back on the lathe, we're going to turn the bottom anyway, so there's really no point in wasting the time surfacing both sides. So by adding this in here, it just acts as a little bit of cushion to take up any imperfections in that ring that's not been surfaced yet. So that way when we put our clamps and our MDF on, we get a good even clamping pressure. So what I'm going to do now while this is drying is I'm going to go ahead and surface the bottom of all the remaining rings. And when we come back, I'll explain why I'm only doing the bottom.